If you feel that your drawings of buildings look a bit flat, even look a bit cartoon-like, here are 5 tips, or really 5 things to consider when you draw to give them a more realistic, a more three-dimensional look. The first point is to work hard at getting the perspective angles correct, because correct perspective angles really do give a sense of realism. They show how a building angled away from us looks. And if it looks right, it will look more three-dimensional. If our perspective doesn't really make sense, if it's not what would happen, if the angles aren't correct with how the building would be looked from a particular point of view in life, then it's not going to add any realism. In fact, it will take away the sense of reality. So working hard to keep our angles the same as we see them in our reference or in our subject in front of us if we're drawing on location is an important thing. If we get the angles wrong and everything else fairly right, it's still going to look awkward. So working hard with the angles is always a worthwhile investment, particularly at the very start of our drawing. The second area to look out for, and this is one that's really commonly neglected. In fact, often I hardly see it being done well at all, and that's what I call the overhangs of a building. And by overhangs, I mean parts that don't line up exactly. So the most obvious one in Australia, certainly with our architecture, is the way that the eaves overhang the walls of the building. It creates a bit of shade against the upper parts of the walls against the hot Australian sun. But when we view from the angle, what that means is that the corners of the eaves, because they overhang the walls, don't necessarily line up with the corner of the wall. And it's easy to presume that it does, or to underestimate the amount of overhang. So if we look at this drawing, if we look at the main building in the centre, and if we look at the right-hand corner, we can see that the guttering that's on the edge of the eaves, we see that the corner of the gutter is actually to the left of the corner of the wall. If we go to the left-hand side of the building, it's even more pronounced because of the positioning where it is. And in fact, the eave overhangs the corner visually by quite a significant amount. And these overhangs really do create a sense of 3 dimensions because they break up the plane of the wall that otherwise would be fairly undisturbed. We also have overhang with the sills of the 2 main windows. They come out from the wall, and so we want to capture that sense of coming out. We want to make sure that we don't just basically draw a rectangle under the window, but there is a depth to it, that it does protrude out from the window. If we look at the chimney even, we can see there's a decorative band that goes around the chimney which protrudes probably half a brick out from the otherwise wall of the chimney. And again, that ends up being a bit like the eaves. It means that this decorative band protrudes past the corners that we see. And it's just a point of careful observation to line it up the same way. I'm drawing this, by the way, with a 0.2 millimeter Copic multiliner, and it took me about 19 minutes to draw in real time. You're watching this at time and a half, I'm pretty sure. If you want to see it any slower, you can use the cog icon for that. Now, the third thing that's important to do if we want to create a sense of 3 dimensions is to make sure that we include depth lines wherever we can. Now, by depth lines, what I mean is the line that indicates, well, the depth of something. So with the windows, for instance, it's the depth line that shows the wall has thickness. But then where there's then timber beading within that, depending on the size of the drawing and depending how close to the front or further back in the depth of plane the window is, we may actually even see depth in the timber beading, and we may be able to do an additional line to indicate that depth. These lines really do create a strong sense of 3 dimensions. Even if it's a shallow depth, it still creates a sense of 3 dimensions. It's very easy to think, oh, that doesn't really matter. But the lack of depth lines really does give a very flat 2-dimensional look. My rule is basically put every one in that I possibly can where my pen width and the scale of the size of the drawing allow it. Now, the fourth way we can give a sense of 3 dimensions is to include shading in our drawing. So shading reflects sunlight. So shade basically is where the sunlight can't reach part of an object because that part of the object is turned away from the light source sufficiently that the light doesn't reach it directly. So in this case, we can see that the wall that we see most of is turned away from the sun. We can see that the side walls actually are in the sunlight, and that end of the roofline is also in the sunlight, more directly than the roof at the front. So when we shade, that really emphasizes the fact that we're looking at a 3-dimensional object, some parts of which angle away from the light source. So shading, where feasible, where practical, at least in some degree, is very helpful in creating a sense of 3 dimensions. And it may be that the sun is in the front of the building, so the whole building's pretty much in light. But often under the tops of the windows, particularly if the wall is a bit thick, there is some sort of shadow being cast down onto the thickness of the walls, and it's good to at least capture that to really make clear that these are, if you like, indents into the wall rather than just rectangles drawn on the outside. The final way we can help our buildings look 3-dimensional is to create a sense of depth in the whole scene, a sense of distance in the whole scene. Because if our drawing has parts that look closer, that feels closer, and then parts that are a bit further away again, and we have some elements that feel quite a long distance away, then that is creating, if you like, a 3-dimensional context for the whole scene, not just our building. And that will have an impact on how we perceive the building, because the wider context will be very 3-dimensional, and therefore the building will draw from that in terms of its visual impact. And so you see me at this point now working on the trees in the distance. You'll notice those cars that I drew underneath the trees, drawn in a very light, very gestural way, because when things are further away, we don't see them as clearly, we don't see the same detail. The edges aren't as hard or as clear as things that are closer. And so by manipulating our line work to echo these visual effects that we see in life, we can create a similar effect in our drawing and therefore create the effective distance, even though every line is just as far or close to us on the sheet of paper as every other line. It creates the feeling, in fact, that parts go further away. So working to create a sense of depth. There I am doing that decorative band on the chimney and making sure I extend it out just slightly for the overhang. So it's not just the box of the chimney that's 3 dimensions, but it's that decorative band as well. And now I add the shading that indicates that, in fact, this is clearly 3 dimensions, and the light can reach part of the building, but it can't reach the part of the building that's angled away from where other parts of the building are in sunlight. So if you think that your buildings end up looking pretty flat, pretty two-dimensional, then firstly make sure that the perspective angles are correct, because that does give a strong sense of realism and that something really is moving away from us at a certain angle. Secondly, where there are overhangs in our drawing, make sure we capture those overhangs accurately, because they break up what often is a fairly flat surface, which can then look a bit two-dimensional, whether they're eaves or gutters or sills or decorative elements such as the banding on the chimney. Include the overhangs whenever we can. And then make sure we do depth lines. Anything that moves backwards from a plane, we want to have that line that shows that breadth. It's not just height and width, but if there's depth, if we can get a line in there to show that, no matter how close it might be to another line, it's worth doing. And then shade emphasizes, highlights, makes clear 3 dimensions, makes clear that there are planes that change in relation to the light source. And finally, if we create a sense of distance in our overall scene, then that creates a 3-dimensional context that our building sits in, and our building will draw a sense of 3 dimensions from that, added to what other 3-dimensional elements we've been able to introduce into it. Now, of course, on a more complex, more ornate building, there's a bit more of this to do. But in some ways, it's even more important to take every chance we can to make a relatively plain building look 3 dimensions, because there's often less visual cues for us to see that. So this isn't a bad example to practice on. And of course, you'll find this photo on my channel community page if you'd like to have a go drawing it yourself. So why not? G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I hope this video is of some assistance if you think your drawings look a bit flat, your buildings look a bit flat, and helps to inject a sense of 3 dimensions into them. But look, whatever you're drawing, however they look, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.